God doesn't forget what they did to you. Let's be clear, God isn't neutral about your pain. He's not standing off to the side while the narcissist destroys your confidence, mocks your spirit, and rewrites the truth like it was theirs to shape. He's not folding his arms while your heart bleeds silently in a room full of people who can't see the war you're fighting inside. He saw it. He counted every tear. He recorded every lie. He listened to every prayer you whispered through trembling lips. And now he is moving. What the narcissist didn't understand is that they weren't just playing games with your emotions. They were tampering with the sacred. They weren't just hurting a person. They were provoking a holy God who doesn't stay silent when his children are violated. This is not revenge as man understands it. This is not petty retaliation. This is divine retribution. Slow, precise, spiritual, and irreversible. Truth always demands balance. There's a spiritual law written into the very fabric of the universe. A law not invented by men, but designed by the eternal hand of God. It is as real as gravity, as constant as the rising sun, and as unyielding as the holiness of heaven. This law does not shout, it does not beg to be noticed, but it governs every unseen consequence of every hidden act, and at the center of that law is this unchangeable principle. You cannot violate the soul of another human being without a response from the God who made that soul. What the narcissist did to you wasn't just emotional immaturity. It wasn't simply poor behavior. It wasn't just another toxic breakup. It was a violation of moral and spiritual order. It was a desecration of something sacred. Not because you were perfect, but because you were made in the image of a perfect God. You offered them loyalty, sincerity, vulnerability, and trust, all of which are reflections of God's heart. And they used those things as weapons. They twisted the very essence of who you are, not for healing, but for control. They didn't just hurt your feelings, they disrupted your connection to the sacred. And God does not stand by while the sacred is mocked. You see, narcissists don't operate with truth, they operate with performance. They build illusions. They manipulate perception. They rely on confusion and emotional exhaustion to get their way, and for a time it works. People believe them. They gather sympathy. They gather praise. Sometimes it even looks like they win, like they get away with everything, while you are left to sort through the wreckage, alone and misunderstood. But there's one thing they can't manipulate: time. And there's one force they can't escape: truth. God is not mocked. His justice is not avoidable. When someone sows destruction, not in anger or weakness, but in premeditated deceit and domination, they are sowing into ground they don't own. The field belongs to God, and whatever is sown there will be harvested in full, whether the world is watching or not. Truth doesn't need applause to be true. It doesn't need witnesses to be real. It simply waits, quietly, patiently, and with precision, because truth always returns, and when it does, it comes carrying balance. That balance may not look the way you expected. It may not come through public exposure or a courtroom confession. It may not be loud or dramatic. In fact, it may begin in secret, in sleepless nights, in a mind haunted by the very illusions they created, in the slow deterioration of peace they can no longer fake. You may never see it with your eyes, but the collapse is real, not because you demanded it, but because heaven did, because the scales of divine justice can only remain tipped for so long before they correct themselves. And when they do, it is not out of vengeance, it is out of alignment. It is the universe responding to what was torn. So if you've ever sat in your room asking, did God see what they did? Does it even matter? Will they ever feel what I felt? The answer is yes. He saw. He never looked away. And he is not idle. He is not indifferent. His delay is not denial, it is set up, it is measured, it is holy. Because the truth you stood in, though it cost you everything, is the very thing that guarantees your restoration and their reckoning. You held to what was right, even when it was lonely. And for that, God says the balance is coming. The field is responding. The weight of justice is shifting. And not a single tear you cried will be wasted. This is not about revenge the way humans define it. It's not about getting even. It's about the order of creation being respected. It's about the moral universe returning to center. It's about God saying, enough. The narcissist thought your silence meant weakness, but what they didn't know is that your silence was sacred ground, and God was standing in it with you. Now, the truth is moving, and no manipulation, no charm, no projection can outrun it. Because in God's world, truth always demands balance. And God, the one who is both judge and defender, will see to it that every scale is made right. In His time, in His way, without fail. But while you may have cried in secret, heaven wasn't blind. And what God saw in silence, He is now answering with judgment. When someone wounds you with intentional cruelty, it may look like a personal conflict on the surface, but in the eyes of God, it goes far deeper than that. What the narcissist did wasn't just manipulative or deceptive. It was profane. It was an offense not only against your humanity, but against the sacred order that makes love, trust, and relationship possible. They didn't just betray a partner, a friend, or a family member. They betrayed the very spiritual principles that govern healthy connection. And when someone tears through the fabric of love with lies, blame-shifting, and psychological distortion, they are not simply causing emotional harm. They are desecrating something holy. The narcissist builds their world on illusions. Always the victim when challenged, always the hero when admired, and never the one to blame. Every relationship they enter is not built on shared truth, but on a performance they must control. They do not engage to love, they engage to win, to own, to dominate, and that domination comes cloaked in charm, in flattery, in false empathy, but beneath that exterior lies something darker, a contempt for vulnerability, a hatred for correction, and a deep, driving need to remain unaccountable no matter what the cost. And that cost, more often than not, is the soul of the person they've targeted. When you gave them your loyalty, you were offering something sacred. Your trust wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual. It was the reflection of the image of God within you, the willingness to believe, to hope, to stand beside someone through difficulty. But the narcissist didn't see your goodness as something to protect. They saw it as something to exploit. They used your honesty as evidence against you. They took your gentleness and framed it as weakness. They took your forgiveness and treated it like permission. And each time they crossed a boundary, they silenced your spirit a little more. Not just to avoid being wrong, but to stay in power. This is more than selfishness. It is desecration. You were not imagining the depth of the betrayal. You were not being dramatic. You were not too sensitive. What you felt was the internal alarm of your spirit recognizing that something sacred was being violated. Your instincts weren't off. They were being spiritually ignored. Because the narcissist wasn't just hurting you. They were reshaping your reality to reflect their need for control. And that reshaping isn't just psychological, it's spiritual warfare, the kind that God does not take lightly. You see, every time they lied to twist the truth, they weren't just breaking a rule, they were rejecting the nature of God, who is truth. Every time they used your emotions against you, they weren't just manipulating, they were mocking the compassion that comes from the heart of heaven. And every time they convinced you that your pain was your fault, They weren't just gaslighting, they were attacking the very source of your worth, the identity God gave you. This is not small, this is not harmless, this is not something you just move on from. This is soul damage, and God sees it for what it is. That's why divine justice doesn't treat narcissistic harm like a minor offense. It treats it like desecration. Because it is. It's the defiling of something pure, the mocking of something holy. And when the narcissist believes they can walk away from such destruction untouched, they're not just deceived, they are living in defiance of the very God who makes justice unavoidable. Their world may seem stable now, their lies may seem to be working, their charm may still be convincing, but they are building their life on sand. And when the rain falls, and the winds blow, and the storm rises, that house will fall. Not because you pushed it, but because truth always comes to collect. So if you've ever doubted whether what they did was as evil as it felt, let this remind you, it was. Not because you're broken, but because you were sacred. Not because you're dramatic, but because you are vulnerable. Not because you're weak, but because your soul still believes in love that honors God. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to protect and to reclaim. You are not crazy. You are not disposable. You are not to blame for how someone else chose to desecrate something God placed inside of you. If this resonates with something buried deep inside, if it reminds you of the betrayal you never had words for, let it bring you back to the truth. God does not take it lightly when someone mocks what He made holy. There is justice, there is consequence, and no matter how long it takes, God is not mocked. Comment below with the words, "He saw it, He's fighting for me." Let that be your declaration today, because the moment you gave your pain to God, the battle shifted in your favor. Yet God doesn't always move loudly. Sometimes His justice arrives in silence, slow, certain, and utterly unstoppable. God's justice is not theatrical. It doesn't move with explosions or loud declarations. It does not need to broadcast itself to be effective. In fact, some of the most devastating forms of divine intervention come in silence, so silent that the person being judged doesn't even realize that judgment has begun. And that's the danger the narcissist never saw coming, because they mistook God's patience for absence. They confused His restraint with apathy. They assumed that silence meant escape, but they were wrong. When someone wounds others repeatedly, habitually, and without remorse, they awaken something in the spiritual realm that cannot be ignored. The narcissist may believe they have cleverly dodged consequences, especially when life on the outside appears to be going well. They may be in new relationships, celebrated in public, even promoted or admired by people who have no idea what they've done behind closed doors. And for the one they hurt, for you, it can feel crushing. It can feel like injustice wins and evil prospers. But that feeling, as real and painful as it is, does not reflect the full story. Because God's justice is not on your timeline, it's on His. He doesn't rush to satisfy human frustration. He moves with holy precision. While we look for signs in the natural, God is operating in the unseen. And by the time judgment becomes visible, it's only because the root has been decaying for a long time beneath the surface. The narcissist doesn't realize this. They interpret the delay as a green light to continue. They interpret the quiet as clearance. But in reality, every manipulative act, every lie, every betrayal was being recorded. Not in a spreadsheet, not in gossip, but in eternity. Divine justice is not revenge. It is not about someone finally getting what they deserve for the sake of personal satisfaction. It's about the universe realigning itself to truth. When someone abuses the truth to build an empire of control, it might stand for a while, It might even thrive in a worldly sense, but it is fragile, hollow, and completely unsustainable, because anything that is built on deception is already cursed by its own foundation. It carries the weight of falsehood, and eventually that weight becomes unbearable. God doesn't need to interfere with a bolt of lightning. He simply lets the narcissist reap what they sow, slowly, inevitably, quietly. He allows time to do what confrontation cannot. Erode the lie from the inside out. The relationships that once seemed unbreakable begin to sour. The charisma that once charmed others begins to wear thin. The confidence that once seemed impenetrable begins to crack, and all of it happens while they still try to maintain the illusion of control. That is the brilliance and severity of divine justice. It lets them believe they're in control, right up until the moment they realize they're not. What God is doing in the background is often more powerful than what we see in the spotlight. He's not just dealing with surface-level actions, he's addressing the heart, the motives, the spirit. And when someone chooses to operate in rebellion against his design for love, truth, and integrity, he doesn't chase them down with punishment. He lets them live inside the collapse of what they've created, because that collapse is far more revealing than any external discipline could ever be. They wanted a world where they were untouchable. They wanted a narrative where they were always right. They wanted relationships they could control and identities they could define. So God, in His justice, gives them the very thing they built, and He lets it fall in on them. Not because He is cruel, but because He is just. And truth, once ignored long enough, becomes consequence. What makes divine justice so terrifying to the narcissist is that they can't predict it, spin it, or escape it. It's not tied to human systems or opinions. It's not subject to manipulation. It doesn't require a crowd to validate it. It moves at its own pace, often slowly, but always with authority. And by the time the narcissist feels it, it's not because someone exposed them. It's because God allowed the structure they worshipped to collapse under the weight of its own deception. They thought they were immune. They thought they were too clever, too likable, too untouchable. But the truth is, no one is above the law of God. And when you spend your life violating others while hiding behind charisma or self-righteousness, you are storing up a reckoning, not from man, but from heaven. And when it arrives, it won't just ruin their reputation, it will reveal the truth of who they really are. And that, to someone who has built their life on falsehood, is the most devastating judgment of all. And as divine justice begins its quiet descent, it doesn't strike the surface first. It begins in the place the narcissist cannot hide from, within. Collapse doesn't always begin with explosions. It doesn't always look like scandal or public humiliation. In fact, the most devastating kind of downfall often begins in silence, in places no one else can see. That's where the narcissist's unraveling takes root. Not in a courtroom, not on a stage, not in the eyes of their admirers, but in the dark, hollow spaces of their own soul. Because the consequence for violating others isn't always immediate, but it is always internal. And when you spend your life building on illusion, the first cracks will always appear in the foundation. Narcissists are masters of external presentation. They know how to appear calm, competent, charming, and even kind when it serves them. They don't just deceive others, they deceive themselves. They've spent years fine-tuning their identity around a version of themselves that never has to be wrong, never has to apologize, never has to change, and for a while, that identity works. It convinces people. It even convinces them. But falsehood can't sustain peace. It can't nourish the soul. It can only entertain the ego, and the ego is never satisfied. Over time, the performance begins to exhaust them, not consciously at first, but gradually, like an ache they can't name. Their relationships become shallow. Their victories feel empty. The admiration they once craved no longer soothes them, and without someone to control, without someone to manipulate or dominate or extract significance from, they start to feel invisible. And because they've rejected truth for so long, they have no compass left to guide them back. That is where the collapse begins, not in the outer world, but in the inner one. In anxiety they can't explain, in sleepless nights, in persistent discontent, in fragile moods and explosive reactions to even the smallest challenges. The structure they built, the mask, the persona, the false stability, begins to crumble under the weight of its own maintenance. It becomes too heavy to carry, too unstable to uphold, too exhausting to protect. And no matter how much they try to patch it up, it's never enough. The very thing they created to survive ends up consuming them. But what's even more tragic is that they often don't know how to stop it. Because they've spent so much time avoiding responsibility, they've lost the ability to reflect. They've burned every bridge of accountability. They've turned away from truth for so long that it no longer feels like a home. It feels like a threat. So instead of confronting their decline, they blame others. They lash out. They retreat into more delusion. And that retreat only accelerates the process. The collapse feeds on denial. The more they resist it, the faster it spreads. To the outside world, they may still look functional. They may still be showing up to work, posting on social media, engaging in surface-level conversations. But inside, the center is hollowing out. The soul is starving. The peace they pretended to have has vanished. And the irony is brutal. Because while they once looked at your pain with indifference, they are now swallowed by a pain they can't even name, and they cannot outrun it. You see, God doesn't always destroy someone by striking them down. Sometimes He simply lets them live long enough to face the consequences of the world they build. He lets their own choices unravel them. He lets the emptiness grow until it echoes. He allows them to feel the weight of the very pain they caused, not through punishment, but through reflection they can no longer escape. It is the justice of God unfolding not with vengeance, but with truth, a truth so inescapable, it becomes their undoing. And in that undoing, something sacred happens, not to them, but to you. Because as their mask begins to fall apart, you begin to see what was real all along, that your worth was never based on their validation, that your suffering wasn't wasted, and that your silence wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. And while their collapse began from within, your healing is beginning there too, quietly, powerfully, permanently. But while they spiral under the weight of their deception, your greatest strength is revealed not in what you do to them, but in what you choose not to do. One of the most misunderstood forms of power is restraint. Not the kind that avoids conflict out of fear, but the kind that deliberately chooses not to mirror the very behavior that broke you. There is something almost supernatural about the decision to walk away from a war you could easily win, especially when you've been provoked, humiliated, manipulated, and discarded by someone who weaponized your love against you. And yet, that is the very kind of power God calls His people to embody. A power rooted not in vengeance, but in conviction. When you've been wounded by a narcissist, every instinct in your body cries out for justice, not because you're vindictive, but because what happened was so profoundly unjust. You weren't simply betrayed, you were redefined in the eyes of others. Your truth was twisted, your goodness was mocked, your intentions were recast as manipulation. And to make matters worse, the person who harmed you most seems to walk away unscathed, admired, perhaps even praised. It's a disorienting pain, one that can tempt even the strongest spirit to fight back, to expose, to defend, to confront. And sometimes that confrontation feels like the only thing that would bring peace. But what if the peace you long for isn't found in fighting to be understood, What if the most powerful thing you could do isn't to retaliate, but to resist the invitation to descend into the same chaos they created? Because make no mistake, the narcissist thrives on engagement. They don't care if your reaction is love or hate, they only care that you're still reacting. Every attempt you make to correct the narrative becomes fuel for their distortion. Every moment you spend trying to get them to admit what they did keeps you tethered to the illusion that they are capable of accountability. But they're not, because accountability requires humility. It requires remorse, and it requires a willingness to step into the light. Narcissists flee from the light. They build their lives in the shadows, behind masks, protected by half-truths and emotionally manipulated versions of reality. They don't fear exposure because of shame. They fear exposure because it would force them to confront the self they spent their entire lives avoiding. This is why silence is not surrender, it's strategy. When you choose not to retaliate, you aren't letting them win. You're choosing to step off the battlefield altogether. You're recognizing that some wars aren't worth fighting, because the battlefield was never real to begin with. It was a trap, designed to keep you engaged, exhausted, and emotionally entangled. The narcissist doesn't need to be right, they just need you to keep playing. They need your defense to validate their offense. They need your pain to confirm their importance. So when you go quiet, not from fear, but from clarity, it doesn't feel like justice at first. It feels like loss. It feels like injustice. But over time, your silence becomes something much greater. It becomes your shield. It becomes the space where God moves on your behalf. We often forget that divine justice is not dependent on our retaliation. It doesn't need our anger to be activated. It doesn't need our bitterness to be justified. God's justice moves in dimensions we cannot see. He weighs the intentions behind every word, every manipulation, every carefully constructed lie. And when you choose not to avenge yourself, you are placing your pain into the hands of someone who sees far more than you ever could. That choice, the surrender of retaliation, is not weakness. It is an act of spiritual warfare. It is you saying, I will not let what broke me become what shapes me. I will not let evil dictate my response. I will not allow this pain to change who I am at the core. That is strength. That is holiness. That is victory on heaven's terms. And there is a kind of restoration that only comes when you trust God enough not to fight back. When you let go of the need to be understood. When you stop defending yourself in a courtroom where the judge has already made up their mind. There is peace that flows from heaven when you stop participating in dysfunction. And that peace is worth far more than temporary vindication. It's the kind of peace that doesn't depend on apologies. It doesn't depend on confessions. It doesn't depend on your truth being acknowledged by the one who distorted it. It's a peace that stands on the confidence that God knows. God saw, and God is not mocked. You may feel like walking away without retaliating is weakness. You may wonder if your silence is letting them get away with it. But heaven sees your restraint not as cowardice, but as consecration. God is not calling you to be passive. He's calling you to be set apart. Because what you're doing in your silence is not enabling, it's elevating. You are rising above what was meant to trap you. You are refusing to become a copy of what hurt you. And that choice, that costly, painful, often lonely choice, is what keeps your soul aligned with truth. Retaliation may feel powerful, but it gives the narcissist the very thing they crave most, your attention. Restraint, on the other hand, is disruptive in a way they cannot process. They know how to fight. They know how to blame. But they do not know how to navigate a silence that isn't rooted in fear, but in healing. And when you step into that silence, not to disappear, but to reclaim yourself. The grip they once had over your spirit begins to break. So, no, not retaliating doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're wise. It means you're choosing the long game. It means you're trusting God to do what only He can do. Bring justice not just to your situation, but to your soul. And as you choose restraint over retaliation, something begins to shift inside you, a deeper transformation that pain alone could never produce. There is a sacred paradox woven into the very nature of human suffering, that pain, when faced honestly and surrendered to God, does not destroy you, it transforms you. This truth is often missed in the fog of trauma, especially when you've been wounded by someone who seemed to move on without consequence, someone who extracted the most intimate parts of your heart and used them as leverage, then discarded you with no apology, no ownership, no closure. That kind of pain is not just relational, it's existential. It shakes your foundation, challenges your identity, and disrupts your understanding of what love is supposed to be. But as devastating as that process is, if you refuse to turn bitter, if you dare to face the full weight of your grief without numbing it or spiritualizing it away, something begins to happen in the deep places of your soul that nothing else in life could produce. What you discover is that there is a kind of clarity that only comes through heartbreak. There is a kind of wisdom that cannot be learned in safety. When your trust has been shattered, when your name has been smeared, when your prayers seem to fall flat, and the one who hurt you appears to be thriving, and yet you still choose to hold on to truth, to integrity, to your relationship with God, you are not failing. You are being refined. You are being rooted. You are becoming unshakable. The narcissist, on the other hand, is not being transformed. They are not growing. They are not becoming deeper or more self-aware. Because their pattern is not to process pain, but to project it, they do not face their failures. They outsource them. They do not learn from suffering. They run from it. And in doing so, they forfeit the very transformation that pain was meant to produce. They circulate their wounds through others, repeating the same cycles, reusing the same masks, reliving the same dysfunctional relationships, all while blaming everyone else for the emptiness they refuse to face. Their charisma becomes a cover for cowardice, their charm a disguise for deep spiritual paralysis. And though their lives may look put together, though they may collect praise, new relationships, even material success, they remain stuck in the same emotional shallowness that caused their collapse in the first place. This is where the great divide happens between you and them. You took the hit and chose to heal. They caused the hit and chose to hide. You stared your brokenness in the face and wept in God's presence until clarity came. They pretended nothing happened and doubled down on the performance. And while they may appear unbothered, what's really happening is slow spiritual corrosion, a hollowing out of character, a steady collapse of peace, an increasing dependence on control to mask the growing anxiety of living out of alignment with truth. Meanwhile, you are rebuilding not just your circumstances, but your inner world. You are reclaiming your sense of self. You are rerouting your identity in something more eternal than other people's opinions. And you are learning that peace doesn't come from being liked. It comes from being honest. There's a heaviness to healing that only those who've walked through real darkness understand. It doesn't come quickly. It doesn't come without cost. You mourn the loss of the fantasy you believed in. You grieve not only what was done to you, but what you allowed in your effort to keep the peace. And yet, in that space of sorrow, God meets you. Not with cliches, not with instant relief, but with truth, mercy, and the kind of presence that doesn't explain away your pain, but sits with you in it until the shame lifts and strength returns. The transformation you're undergoing is invisible to most, and that's okay, because the most powerful changes are not cosmetic, they are internal. They are forged in silence, in discipline, in days where you choose not to spiral, not to retaliate, not to seek external validation, but to keep showing up with honesty and courage in your own process. You may not look impressive, but you are becoming invincible, not because you've avoided pain, but because you let God teach you through it. You surrendered your need for closure and chose healing instead. You stopped begging for answers and started discerning patterns. You no longer wait for them to get it, because you've already decided that your peace doesn't depend on their repentance. That is the mark of transformation. You are no longer living in reaction to what broke you. You are building from a new foundation, one that isn't shaped by fear or betrayal, but by clarity, conviction, and truth. And that transformation will outlast their performance, because while they continue to repeat, you are rising. While they remain hollow, you are becoming whole. While they hide from themselves, you are learning to face yourself and love what you find, even in your most vulnerable moments. So yes, pain has changed you, but not in the way they intended. It didn't make you smaller. It made you deeper. It didn't harden you. It refined you. And in a world that confuses loudness with strength and charm with depth, your quiet, honest healing is a sacred rebellion. You are walking a road most people never find the courage to face. And that road, narrow, painful, costly, is leading you somewhere. Their illusion could never go into truth, into peace, into a version of you that cannot be manipulated again. That transformation doesn't just heal, it awakens you. And the moment you awaken to truth, their carefully crafted illusion begins to unravel. There's a turning point in every survivor's story. A moment so quiet it almost goes unnoticed, and yet so spiritually powerful it shifts the balance of everything. It's not when you finally get the apology. It's not when they're exposed. It's not when others finally believe you. It's something far more profound, far more internal. It's the moment you wake up, the moment you realize that your healing no longer depends on their acknowledgement, that your worth was never tied to their perception, that your identity is not something they get to narrate. That awakening, that clear, raw, irreversible awakening, is the moment the grip they had over you begins to break. And it's also the moment their carefully controlled illusion begins to fall apart. Narcissists build their power on confusion. They need you to second-guess yourself. They need you emotionally off balance. They thrive in chaos, not because they like disorder, but because it allows them to define reality. If you're constantly unsure of what's true, if you're always wondering whether it's your fault, then you'll keep looking to them for clarity. And that, to them, is control. That's why the games are never ending. That's why the story always changes. That's why no matter how much you try to explain, reason, or prove your sincerity, they twist it. Because the goal was never understanding. The goal was control, disguised as conversation. But when you awaken, when you begin to see the pattern, you stop playing, you stop explaining, you stop negotiating your worth in an emotional economy where they hold all the currency. And that shift is devastating to the narcissist, not because you've exposed them, but because you've exited the framework where they held power. You've stepped out of the performance. You've stopped responding to their cues, and without your reactions, their stage starts to collapse. This is the unraveling they never saw coming. It doesn't happen because you publicly shamed them. It doesn't happen because you fought back harder. It happens because you stopped needing them to validate what you already knew. The moment you chose inner clarity over external approval, you broke the invisible contract they had relied on. the unspoken agreement that you would always carry the weight of their dysfunction in the name of love, loyalty, or peace. And once you refuse to carry what never belonged to you, they are left with the full weight of themselves, something they've spent a lifetime avoiding. Your awakening forces a mirror in front of them, a mirror they can't escape, one they can't shatter with lies or distract with charm. Because now the reflection is no longer being filtered through confusion or desperation. It's being held by someone who sees clearly, who no longer flinches, who no longer fears their disapproval. That kind of clarity is more threatening than confrontation. It's not reactive, it's not emotional, it simply is. And in the presence of that unwavering truth, their entire identity starts to tremble. You see, narcissists rely not just on manipulation, but on agreement. They need others to participate in their delusion. They need you to nod silently when they rewrite history, to go quiet when they lie, to excuse them when they hurt you. But when you awaken, you withdraw that agreement. You stop co-signing the falsehoods. And without that participation, their sense of control begins to implode. This is not just psychological, it's spiritual. Because what you've reclaimed is not just your voice, it's your authority. And the enemy hates nothing more than a person who knows who they are in God. That's what makes your awakening so powerful. You're not just moving on, you're moving up. You're stepping out of the toxic fog and standing in the truth that was always there, but that you were conditioned to doubt. You're learning to trust your discernment again. You're beginning to see patterns where once there was only confusion. You've stopped defending yourself in conversations where the goal was never peace, only control. And that shift terrifies them, because now their tactics no longer work. Their words no longer land. Their charm no longer seduces. Their guilt no longer sticks. And all they have left is the hollow sound of their own echo. And perhaps most unsettling for the narcissist is the fact that your awakening doesn't come with rage or revenge. It comes with calm, with steadiness, with peace. And that peace is the final, undeniable evidence that they no longer hold sway over your spirit. Because while they are still cycling through drama, still seeking attention, still rebranding their dysfunction as charm, you are simply done. Not bitter, not broken, just done. And in that holy silence, their greatest fear becomes real. That they no longer define you, distract you, or drain you. What you may not realize is that while you were breaking, crying, grieving, questioning everything, a new version of you was being formed in the fire, stronger, clearer, wiser. And now that you've awakened to the truth, you're no longer the same person they once controlled. You are not returning to the dynamic. You are not repeating the cycle. You are not reaching back for crumbs of love that were always conditional. You are walking forward, steady in who you are, aligned with the God who brought you through. And while they scramble to regain control, to reconstruct the illusion, to recruit others who will still buy into their version of reality, you are no longer in the audience. You are not watching the performance. You've left the theater. You've reclaimed your place as someone made in the image of a God who does not lie, who does not gaslight, who does not manipulate. Your awakening is not just healing for you, it is judgment for them, not because you wished it, but because truth, when finally seen, always has consequences. And while your eyes were opening, theirs were shutting tighter. That is the difference between the healed and the hardened. But your awakening is not just about clarity, it's about freedom. And while you're rising in truth, they're being buried beneath the very image they worshipped. There's a kind of freedom that doesn't announce itself with noise, applause, or spectacle. It doesn't come with headlines, social media posts, or dramatic turning points. Instead, it arrives quietly, like a deep exhale after years of holding your breath. This is the kind of freedom you walk into, after surviving the storm of emotional entanglement with a narcissist. It's not the freedom that comes because everything is resolved and wrapped in neat closure. It's the kind that emerges when you finally realize you don't need resolution to be whole. You don't need answers to rest. You don't need them to understand, to regret, or to repent. Because the person they tried to control, reshape, minimize, and silence no longer exists. That version of you, fragile, unsure, dependent on their validation, has been replaced by someone who knows their own worth, even in the absence of recognition. This freedom is sacred. It's internal. It's born from the decision to stop begging for justice from those who are incapable of giving it. You've learned that waiting for someone who broke you to fix you is like waiting for a thief to return and build you a new home. It's a false hope, and you've let it go. You've stopped explaining your pain to people committed to misunderstanding it. You've stopped reopening wounds just to prove they were real. You no longer feel the need to defend yourself in a trial where the verdict was written before you even spoke. That's not giving up. That's growing up. That's the healing God brings after devastation. A kind of restoration, not just of your outer life, but of your inner authority. And as you rise, something profound happens in parallel. Something you may never see with your natural eyes, but is absolutely unfolding in the unseen. While you're being set free, the narcissist is being buried by the very image they worked so hard to protect. The mask they built, the charming, intelligent, lovable, always right persona, becomes their prison. It demands to be maintained. It requires constant attention, constant validation, constant control, and the irony is devastating. The very thing they used to appear strong is now the very thing that's weakening them. Because no one, not even the most convincing manipulator, can live forever behind a mask without breaking beneath it. Unlike you, they are not transforming through their pain. They are not reflecting. They are not surrendering to the process of growth. Instead, they're trapped in performance. Every new relationship becomes another stage. Every conversation, a carefully managed script, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the pressure begins to mount, because pretending to be someone you're not is exhausting. Lying, even if you believe your own lies, carries a spiritual weight, and over time that weight becomes unbearable. The collapse won't always be visible. They might still appear composed in public. They might still post pictures with wide smiles and new partners. They might still walk into rooms where people greet them with admiration. But behind the scenes, their soul is crumbling. Not because someone cursed them, but because God allowed them to live long enough to experience the consequences of the world they built. The applause feels emptier. The victories feel meaningless. The relationships, no matter how new or exciting, start to follow the same pattern. And deep down, they know something is wrong. They know they've lost something, though they can't name it. And the truth is, they lost you. Not just your presence, but your energy, your attention, your belief in them. The reflection of their false self that you used to feed. That loss is haunting, not because they loved you, but because you once gave them a mirror they could survive inside of. Now that mirror is gone, and they're forced to face themselves. But they don't know how. They've spent their lives avoiding introspection. They run from silence, because in silence the truth is loud. They run from stillness, because stillness reveals what distraction hides, and so they try to replace you with new supply, new admiration, new drama, anything to escape the emptiness growing inside. But no matter how far they run, they can't outrun their own soul. And that soul, bruised, distorted, and starved of truth, begins to collapse under the weight of the mask. Meanwhile, you are discovering life without the weight of proving yourself. You are waking up with clarity. You are speaking truth without needing it to be validated. You are walking into rooms without wondering how to shrink. Your prayers are no longer desperate cries for rescue, but steady conversations with a God who never left your side, even when you thought he was silent. And perhaps the most powerful part of your freedom is this: you no longer need them to fall in order for you to rise. You've detached your healing from their unraveling. You're not tracking their life anymore. You're not checking to see if they've collapsed, because you're too busy living in what they tried to destroy, your peace. That peace doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need vindication. It doesn't need applause. It simply exists, rooted in truth, anchored in the God who brought you through. You've walked through fire and didn't become flame. You've passed through deep waters and didn't drown. You've been betrayed and didn't lose your capacity to trust again, not in people, but in the Spirit who lives inside you. And that is a miracle no narcissist can manufacture. So let them hold on to their mask. Let them maintain their performance. Let them gather their audience, because none of it can give them what you now carry in your silence. Freedom. Not freedom from consequence, but freedom from bondage. Not freedom from pain, but freedom from its grip. You are no longer defined by what they did. You are defined by how God redeemed what they tried to ruin. And as they sink deeper into the world of their own making, you are standing in the world God is remaking in you. A world built not on control or image, but on unshakable truth. God doesn't forget what they did to you. Let's be clear, God isn't neutral about your pain. He's not standing off to the side while the narcissist destroys your confidence, mocks your spirit, and rewrites the truth like it was theirs to shape. He's not folding his arms while your heart bleeds silently in a room full of people who can't see the war you're fighting inside. He saw it. He counted every tear. He recorded every lie. He listened to every prayer you whispered through trembling lips. And now he is moving. What the narcissist didn't understand is that they weren't just playing games with your emotions. They were tampering with the sacred. They weren't just hurting a person. They were provoking a holy God who doesn't stay silent when his children are violated. This is not revenge as man understands it. This is not petty retaliation. This is divine retribution. Slow, precise, spiritual, and irreversible. Truth always demands balance. There's a spiritual law written into the very fabric of the universe. A law not invented by men, but designed by the eternal hand of God. It is as real as gravity, as constant as the rising sun, and as unyielding as the holiness of heaven. This law does not shout, it does not beg to be noticed, but it governs every unseen consequence of every hidden act, and at the center of that law is this unchangeable principle. You cannot violate the soul of another human being without a response from the God who made that soul. What the narcissist did to you wasn't just emotional immaturity. It wasn't simply poor behavior. It wasn't just another toxic breakup. It was a violation of moral and spiritual order. It was a desecration of something sacred. Not because you were perfect, but because you were made in the image of a perfect God. You offered them loyalty, sincerity, vulnerability, and trust, all of which are reflections of God's heart. And they used those things as weapons. They twisted the very essence of who you are, not for healing, but for control. They didn't just hurt your feelings, they disrupted your connection to the sacred. And God does not stand by while the sacred is mocked. You see, narcissists don't operate with truth, they operate with performance. They build illusions. They manipulate perception. They rely on confusion and emotional exhaustion to get their way, and for a time it works. People believe them. They gather sympathy. They gather praise. Sometimes it even looks like they win, like they get away with everything, while you are left to sort through the wreckage, alone and misunderstood. But there's one thing they can't manipulate: time. And there's one force they can't escape: truth. God is not mocked. His justice is not avoidable. When someone sows destruction, not in anger or weakness, but in premeditated deceit and domination, they are sowing into ground they don't own. The field belongs to God, and whatever is sown there will be harvested in full, whether the world is watching or not. Truth doesn't need applause to be true. It doesn't need witnesses to be real. It simply waits, quietly, patiently, and with precision, because truth always returns, and when it does, it comes carrying balance. That balance may not look the way you expected. It may not come through public exposure or a courtroom confession. It may not be loud or dramatic. In fact, it may begin in secret, in sleepless nights, in a mind haunted by the very illusions they created, in the slow deterioration of peace they can no longer fake. You may never see it with your eyes, but the collapse is real, not because you demanded it, but because heaven did, because the scales of divine justice can only remain tipped for so long before they correct themselves. And when they do, it is not out of vengeance, it is out of alignment. It is the universe responding to what was torn. So if you've ever sat in your room asking, did God see what they did? Does it even matter? Will they ever feel what I felt? The answer is yes. He saw. He never looked away. And he is not idle. He is not indifferent. His delay is not denial. It is set up. It is measured. It is holy. Because the truth you stood in, though it cost you everything, is the very thing that guarantees your restoration and their reckoning. You held to what was right, even when it was lonely. And for that, God says the balance is coming. The field is responding. The weight of justice is shifting. And not a single tear you cried will be wasted. This is not about revenge the way humans define it. It's not about getting even. It's about the order of creation being respected. It's about the moral universe returning to center. It's about God saying, enough. The narcissist thought your silence meant weakness, but what they didn't know is that your silence was sacred ground, and God was standing in it with you. Now, the truth is moving, and no manipulation, no charm, no projection can outrun it. Because in God's world, truth always demands balance. And God, the one who is both judge and defender, will see to it that every scale is made right. In His time, in His way, without fail. But while you may have cried in secret, heaven wasn't blind. And what God saw in silence, He is now answering with judgment. When someone wounds you with intentional cruelty, it may look like a personal conflict on the surface, but in the eyes of God, it goes far deeper than that. What the narcissist did wasn't just manipulative or deceptive. It was profane. It was an offense not only against your humanity, but against the sacred order that makes love, trust, and relationship possible. They didn't just betray a partner, a friend, or a family member. They betrayed the very spiritual principles that govern healthy connection. And when someone